There was a time when a steaming pot of soup could bring an entire household together. Before supermarkets offered endless aisles of ready-made meals and packaged ingredients, families depended heavily on what they could grow, preserve, store, or gather. A few potatoes from the cellar, some onions from the garden, dried beans from the pantry, and a handful of greens could become a meal capable of feeding an entire family. These soups weren't complicated, but they were practical, flavorful, and deeply connected to the seasons. Today, many of these recipes have faded from everyday cooking. So here at Fresh Homegrown Harvest, we're bringing them back. What makes these soups especially interesting is that they don't depend on expensive ingredients or complicated cooking techniques. Most are built around vegetables, beans, peas, grains, herbs, and other simple plant-based ingredients. Many can also be adapted according to whatever happens to be growing in your garden. That means you don't necessarily need to follow a recipe word for word. Instead, you can learn the basic idea and make the soup your own. So, if you love old-fashioned cooking, gardening, and making delicious meals from simple ingredients, stay with us until the end, because we're counting down 20 forgotten plant-based soups our grandparents swore by. Number 20. Old-fashioned potato soup. Let's begin with one of the simplest soups imaginable, potato soup. Potatoes have always been a dependable crop because they can provide a substantial harvest from relatively little space, and they can be stored for long periods under appropriate conditions. That made them an incredibly useful ingredient for families who needed food that could last beyond the growing season. An old-fashioned potato soup might begin with chopped onions gently cooked until soft. Potatoes are then added along with vegetable broth or water, followed by simple seasonings such as black pepper, parsley, thyme, or garlic. As the potatoes cook, some break down naturally and thicken the broth, creating a wonderfully comforting texture. Some cooks would mash part of the potatoes while leaving the rest in chunks. Others preferred a completely smooth soup. Either way, the result is warm, filling, and remarkably satisfying considering how few ingredients are involved. If you've ever grown potatoes yourself, you know that a basket of freshly harvested potatoes can become the foundation for countless meals, and this classic soup is one of the best examples. Number 19. Cabbage and bean soup. Cabbage was another dependable garden crop, particularly because certain varieties can tolerate cooler conditions and provide a generous harvest. Instead of treating cabbage as a side dish, older cooks often made it the star of hearty meals. For this soup, chopped cabbage can be combined with cooked white beans, onions, carrots, garlic, and tomatoes. Vegetable broth brings everything together, while herbs such as thyme or parsley add another layer of flavor. As the cabbage slowly cooks, it becomes tender and develops a mild sweetness that works beautifully with the creamy beans. The wonderful thing about this recipe is its flexibility. Have some leftover potatoes? Add them. Extra carrots? Into the pot they go. Have a little celery or green beans available? They can work too. That's the beauty of old-fashioned cooking. The goal wasn't always to create an exact restaurant-style dish. It was to make something delicious from what was available. Number 18. Split pea and vegetable soup. Split peas may look ordinary, but they can transform into an incredibly rich and satisfying soup. Dried split peas were particularly useful because they could be stored in the pantry and turned into a meal long after the fresh garden harvest had disappeared. A traditional plant-based version combines split peas with onions, carrots, celery, potatoes, garlic, and herbs. Everything simmers together until the peas become soft enough to break down and thicken the broth. The result is a soup with a naturally creamy consistency without needing cream. Green split peas create a beautiful color, while yellow split peas offer a slightly different appearance and flavor. Either way, this soup is a reminder that some of the most useful ingredients in a kitchen aren't necessarily the most glamorous ones. Sometimes a humble bag of dried peas can become something extraordinary. Number 17. Rustic lentil soup. Lentils have been part of traditional cooking in many parts of the world for generations, and there's a good reason for that. They're convenient, versatile, and excellent for creating hearty plant-based meals. A rustic lentil soup could start with onions, carrots, celery, and garlic. Add lentils, tomatoes, vegetable broth, and herbs, and then allow everything to simmer until the lentils become tender. You can leave the soup chunky or blend a portion of it to create a thicker consistency. One of the best things about lentil soup is how adaptable it can be. You can add spinach, kale, potatoes, squash, or other vegetables. You can make it tomato-based or keep the broth lighter. A squeeze of lemon at the end can also brighten the flavors. It is a simple soup that can easily change depending on what's available in your kitchen or garden. Number 16. Garden vegetable soup. This might be the ultimate garden soup because it doesn't really have to follow a strict recipe. The entire idea is to use the vegetables that are available. Imagine a large pot filled with carrots, potatoes, tomatoes, green beans, zucchini, peas, cabbage, onions, and fresh herbs. Not every garden will have all of these vegetables at the same time, and that's perfectly fine. Use what you have. The harder vegetables can go into the pot first, while quicker cooking vegetables can be added later. Tomatoes can contribute acidity and sweetness, while onions and garlic build the foundation of flavor. Fresh parsley or other herbs can be stirred in near the end. This is one of those soups where every batch tells a different story. The soup you make in early summer might taste completely different from the one you make during autumn harvest season, and that's exactly what makes it special. Number 13. Creamy corn and potato soup. Fresh corn and potatoes are a surprisingly powerful combination. Corn provides natural sweetness, while potatoes contribute body and thickness. Start with onions and garlic, then add diced potatoes and vegetable broth. Once the potatoes are nearly tender, add fresh corn kernels. Allow everything to cook until the vegetables are soft, then blend some or all of the soup. Blending only part of it can create an especially nice texture because you get a creamy base while still keeping pieces of corn and potato in every spoonful. Fresh green onions or parsley make a great finishing touch. For gardeners growing sweet corn, this is also a wonderful way to turn a fresh harvest into something beyond the usual corn-on-the-cob meal. When the garden gives you plenty of corn, having several different ways to use it becomes extremely valuable. Number 14. Carrot and ginger soup. Carrots are often treated as supporting ingredients, but they can become the star of an entire meal. Their natural sweetness makes them particularly well-suited to smooth soups. To make a simple carrot and ginger soup, cook onions and carrots together before adding vegetable broth and a small amount of fresh ginger. Let everything simmer until the carrots become completely tender, then blend until smooth. The ginger adds gentle warmth and gives the naturally sweet carrots a more interesting character. A little black pepper or fresh parsley can finish the dish beautifully. This soup is also a reminder that you don't need dozens of ingredients to create something memorable. Sometimes the secret is simply combining a few ingredients that complement each other and allowing them to shine. Number 13. Rustic barley and vegetable soup. Long before modern convenience foods became common, grains played an important role in everyday cooking. Barley was especially useful because it stored well and added texture and substance to soups. A rustic barley soup can combine barley with onions, carrots, celery, potatoes, tomatoes, mushrooms, and vegetable broth. The mixture is simmered slowly until the barley becomes tender. As it cooks, the barley absorbs the flavors of the vegetables and broth. The result is a soup with a pleasant chewiness and a hearty texture. Fresh thyme or parsley can add a wonderful herbal note. And if you have mushrooms available, they can provide an earthy flavor that makes the soup even more satisfying. This is the kind of meal that feels perfect after a long day outside. It is simple, rustic, and comforting without needing complicated ingredients. Number 12. White bean and tomato soup. Beans and tomatoes are one of those combinations that seem almost destined to work together. The acidity of tomatoes balances the creamy texture of beans, while onions, garlic, and herbs bring everything together. For this soup, use cooked white beans along with tomatoes, carrots, onions, garlic, and vegetable broth. Let everything simmer until the vegetables are tender. Here's an old-fashioned trick that still works beautifully. Mash some of the beans against the side of the pot. This releases their creamy interior into the broth and naturally thickens the soup without requiring additional ingredients. Rosemary, thyme, basil, or parsley can all work depending on the flavor you're looking for. And if you have tomatoes preserved from your garden, this can become an excellent cold season recipe. Number 11. Old-fashioned onion soup. The humble onion deserves much more attention than it usually receives. It appears in countless recipes, but when cooked slowly and given enough time, onions can become the foundation of an entire soup. Start by slicing onions and cooking them gently until they become soft and deeply fragrant. The longer they cook, the more their natural sweetness develops. Add vegetable broth and herbs, then allow everything to simmer. You can serve this soup as a simple broth or add toasted bread for extra texture and substance. The key is patience. Rushing the onions can prevent them from developing the deep flavor that makes this soup special. This recipe perfectly captures the philosophy of old-fashioned cooking. You don't always need expensive ingredients. Sometimes you simply need to treat ordinary ingredients with care. Number 10. Creamy pumpkin soup. Pumpkin may be famous for pies, but it deserves a much bigger role in savory cooking. When cooked and blended, pumpkin can create a naturally smooth and satisfying soup. Begin with pumpkin or another winter squash, then add onions, garlic, vegetable broth, and herbs. Simmer until everything is tender before blending until smooth. You can add ginger for warmth, thyme for an earthy flavor, or a small amount of nutmeg for a classic autumn character. Roasting the pumpkin first can also intensify its flavor. For gardeners, pumpkin soup can be particularly useful because pumpkins and winter squash can provide substantial harvests. When you have more squash than you can immediately eat, transforming some into soup gives you another way to enjoy the harvest later. Number 9. Fresh pea and mint soup. Fresh peas have a naturally sweet flavor that makes them perfect for a lighter soup. If you've ever eaten peas straight from the garden, you already know that freshly harvested peas can have a remarkable sweetness. For this soup, gently cook onions before adding peas and vegetable broth. Simmer just until the peas are tender, then blend until smooth. Fresh mint can be added afterward, giving the soup a refreshing contrast. The important thing is not to overcook the peas. The goal is to preserve their bright flavor rather than turning them dull and overcooked. This soup is especially lovely during the warmer months when the garden is producing fresh peas and herbs. It offers a completely different experience from the heavier soups associated with winter. Number 8. Mushroom and barley soup. Mushrooms and barley create a combination that feels almost tailor-made for a rustic kitchen. Mushrooms bring earthy flavor, while barley provides texture and substance. Begin by cooking onions, carrots, celery, and sliced mushrooms. Once the mushrooms become fragrant, add barley and vegetable broth. Allow everything to simmer until the barley is tender. Thyme works particularly well here because its earthy aroma complements the mushrooms. If you're interested in using wild mushrooms, always make sure they have been positively identified as safe by someone qualified to do so. For everyday cooking, commercially grown mushrooms are a straightforward choice. The finished soup is hearty, warming, and deeply satisfying. It's exactly the sort of recipe that could have been prepared in a farmhouse kitchen when the weather turned cool. Number 7. Turnip and potato soup. Turnips were once much more common sight in household gardens. Today, they sometimes get overlooked, but they can be excellent in soup. Their slightly peppery flavor pairs beautifully with potatoes, which help mellow the taste and provide a creamy consistency. Cook turnips and potatoes with onions, carrots, garlic, and vegetable broth until tender, then blend the soup until smooth, or leave some vegetables intact for a rustic texture. This recipe is worth remembering because it shows how an overlooked crop can become the star of a meal. Sometimes a vegetable isn't boring at all, it simply hasn't been given the right opportunity. And if you're trying to grow a garden with practical crops, turnips can be worth considering because they provide another useful root vegetable for the kitchen. Number 6. Rustic tomato and bread soup. Imagine having a basket of ripe tomatoes and some bread that is no longer perfectly fresh. Instead of throwing anything away, an old-fashioned cook could turn those ingredients into a satisfying soup. Begin with tomatoes, onions, garlic, herbs, and vegetable broth. Once the mixture is simmering, tear pieces of bread into the pot. The bread absorbs the flavorful liquid and thickens the soup. The result can be chunky and rustic or partially blended into a smoother consistency. Fresh basil makes a wonderful addition if you have it growing in the garden. This recipe represents something that modern kitchens can sometimes forget. Leftovers can be ingredients rather than waste. With a little creativity, food that seems past its prime can become part of something completely new. Number 5. Chickpea and spinach soup. Chickpeas and leafy greens create a wonderfully balanced combination. Chickpeas bring substance and texture, while spinach cooks quickly and adds color. Start with onions, garlic, carrots, tomatoes, and vegetable broth. Add cooked chickpeas and let the mixture simmer so the flavors can come together. Then add fresh spinach near the end. The spinach doesn't need much cooking. A few minutes is usually enough to soften it while keeping its fresh character. You can finish the soup with herbs, black pepper, or a little lemon juice. And if your garden is producing more leafy greens than you can eat at once, recipes like this become incredibly useful. The combination of a pantry staple and a fresh garden ingredient is exactly the kind of cooking that made traditional soups so practical. Number 4. Creamy cauliflower soup. Cauliflower may not look particularly exciting when sitting in the garden or on a kitchen counter, but it can become incredibly smooth and creamy when cooked properly. For a simple version, combine cauliflower with onion, garlic, potatoes, and vegetable broth. Simmer everything until completely tender, then blend until smooth. The potatoes help give the soup body, while the cauliflower provides the main flavor. Fresh herbs can brighten the finished bowl. You can also roast the cauliflower before making the soup if you want a deeper flavor. Roasting encourages browning and adds another dimension to an otherwise simple vegetable. This is another excellent example of how plant-based cooking can create a rich texture without relying on complicated ingredients. Number 3. Hearty bean and green soup. Now we're reaching the kind of soup that can easily become the centerpiece of a meal. Beans and leafy greens have been paired together in many traditional cuisines, and the combination makes perfect sense. Start with cooked beans, onions, carrots, garlic, and tomatoes. Add vegetable broth and allow the mixture to simmer, then add kale, collard greens, or another sturdy leafy green. As the greens soften, they absorb the flavors of the broth while adding texture and color. Herbs such as thyme, rosemary, or parsley can make the soup even more fragrant. For gardeners, this recipe has another advantage. Leafy greens can sometimes produce a surprisingly large harvest, and soup is a convenient way to use a generous amount. Instead of seeing an overflowing basket of greens as a problem, you can see it as an opportunity to make a big pot of soup. Number 2. 7-vegetable farmhouse soup. At number 2, we're embracing the true spirit of the old-fashioned vegetable garden. A 7-vegetable farmhouse soup doesn't need to contain exactly 7 vegetables. The number simply represents the idea of combining whatever useful produce happens to be available. You might use potatoes, carrots, cabbage, onions, celery, green beans, and tomatoes. Another batch might contain zucchini, peas, squash, kale, or corn. The process is simple. Begin with onions and garlic. Add the vegetables that require the longest cooking time, followed by softer vegetables later. Add broth, herbs, and perhaps beans or barley for additional substance. What you end up with is a soup where every spoonful contains something different. And that's exactly what makes farmhouse soup so wonderful. It doesn't demand perfection. It celebrates abundance. Number 1. The ultimate old-fashioned vegetable and bean soup. And finally, our number 1 forgotten soup is the ultimate vegetable and bean soup. This is the kind of recipe that brings together everything we've talked about. Onions, carrots, celery, potatoes, tomatoes, cabbage, green beans, garlic, and herbs can all come together in one enormous pot. But the real secret isn't the ingredient list. It's the philosophy behind the recipe. use what you have. If you have zucchini, use zucchini. If you have extra cabbage, add cabbage. If your potatoes are abundant, let them take center stage. If you have beans in the pantry, add them for extra substance. There is no need to make every batch identical. In fact, the differences are part of the tradition. One batch might taste like summer because it contains fresh tomatoes, green beans, corn, and basil. Another might feel like autumn because it contains pumpkin, cabbage, potatoes, carrots, and thyme. The soup changes because the garden changes. And that may be the most beautiful thing about traditional garden cooking. These soups weren't created simply because people wanted interesting recipes. They developed because people needed practical ways to turn available ingredients into meals. A garden wasn't just a place where vegetables grew. It was part of the household food system. When tomatoes were abundant, people found ways to preserve and use them. When beans matured, they became pantry staples. When cabbage was harvested, it could become soup. When potatoes were dug from the soil, they could be stored and used for months. Nothing had to be perfect. A carrot didn't need to look like the carrots in a supermarket display. A potato didn't need to be perfectly shaped. A cabbage didn't need to be enormous. The goal was simply to turn the harvest into something useful. And this is one of the reasons these forgotten soups are worth bringing back. They encourage us to think differently about food. Instead of asking, what recipe can I make with this one vegetable, we can ask, what can I create from everything I have? That small change in thinking can make cooking much more creative. It can also help reduce waste. A handful of vegetables that might seem insignificant on their own can become part of a large, flavorful pot of soup. A few carrots that aren't needed for another recipe can go in. An extra potato can go in. Some leftover beans can go in. A handful of spinach can go in near the end. Suddenly, those little ingredients become part of a meal. And if you grow your own food, soups can be one of the best ways to appreciate the full value of a garden. Your harvest doesn't have to be eaten immediately. Some vegetables can be stored properly, others can be frozen or preserved using appropriate food safety methods. Dried beans and grains can remain in the pantry, herbs can be dried, tomatoes can be preserved for later cooking. That means a garden can continue contributing to your meals long after the growing season changes. And maybe that's what our grandparents understood so well. They knew that good food didn't necessarily come from having more. It often came from using what you had wisely. A few vegetables, a little patience, a warm pot, and enough time for simple ingredients to become something wonderful. So, the next time you find yourself staring at a basket of vegetables from your garden, don't underestimate what you're holding. Those potatoes could become creamy potato soup. Those tomatoes could become rustic tomato and bread soup. Those beans could become a hearty vegetable and bean soup. That cabbage could become a comforting cabbage and bean soup. Those carrots could become a bright carrot and ginger soup. And that enormous harvest of greens you've been wondering how to use could become one of the most satisfying soups you've made all year. The recipes may be old, but the idea behind them is timeless. Grow what you can, use what you have, waste as little as possible, and turn simple ingredients into food worth sharing. That's the real legacy behind these forgotten soups. So, which one would you bring back to your kitchen first? Would it be number 20, the humble potato soup? Maybe the creamy pumpkin soup? Perhaps the mushroom and barley soup? Or would you go straight for number 1 and make a huge pot of old-fashioned vegetable and bean soup? Tell us your choice in the comments. And if your family has an old soup recipe that's been passed down through generations, share the name with us. You might just help another forgotten recipe make its way back into someone's kitchen. If you enjoyed this journey into old-fashioned garden cooking, make sure you subscribe to Fresh Homegrown Harvest. We explore home gardening, traditional food ideas, useful crops, harvests, and practical ways to make the most of what you grow. Because sometimes the best food isn't found in the newest cookbook. Sometimes it's waiting in an old family recipe. Sometimes it's growing quietly in the garden. And sometimes all it needs is a simple pot, a little patience, and someone willing to remember. Thanks for watching Fresh Homegrown Harvest. And until next time, keep growing, keep harvesting, and keep bringing the wisdom of the old garden back to life.